It's my great privilege today to be with Jessica Martin for our interview. Now, the first interview we did in this series was with Professor Alison Milbank. And Alison combines an academic career as a professor of English literature and whilst being ordained in the Church of England. And it's quite common to be involved in academic life and church life. And so it's wonderful today to be interviewing Jessica Martin, who, like Alison, is a working canon at the Cathedral in Ely and has a prestigious academic career and an author and a writer with theology and her role as a priest in the Church of England. This interview is also wonderful today because we've already interviewed your husband, Jessica, who I'm going to call a distinguished clergy spouse, Francis Spufford. And we had a delightful time interviewing him, but been really looking forward to interviewing you today. So thank you for being with us. As this is a type of oral history, could I begin with asking where and when you were born?
I was born in Surrey, at Kingston-on-Thames, although I grew up in Woking, in 1963.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, your husband Francis, who I'm only going to mention again briefly, so we can focus on you, Jessica, he wrote a book called The Child That Books Built. You similarly have written about your adolescent self in your wonderful book, Holiness and Desire, that we're going to return to. And it's just wonderful for us to set the scene of you personally where you were. Do you have what are some of your earliest memories of where and when you were born and growing up as a child?
The very earliest memory that I have is actually from when I was about 18 months old. And I had measles and chickenpox at the same time.
Oh my goodness, gosh.
Which, and the memory is of standing in a tin bath in front of the fire at my grandma's house, which was in the north of England, and having my nappy taken off, and the sheer relief, because I was so hot and so itchy and so miserable. And obviously it made a huge impression because I can still remember it really vividly. And I think it's quite unusual to remember back to about 18 months, but apparently that's how old I was.
Gosh, wonderful. Thank you. Now, you're a child of distinguished scholars, sociologists on your side of the family. And I want to move on to that in a minute. But when we do these histories, we found it helpful to begin going back to maternal and paternal grandparents. Could you tell us a little bit about your grandparents?
Sure. So I didn't know my maternal grandfather because he died when my mother was in her teens. And my maternal grandmother grew up in the cotton mill town of Bury in Lancashire. And she was the 8th of, I think, 12 children. And she herself had 7 children, of whom my mother was the oldest. So I have thousands and thousands of cousins who are all sort of scattered around the Rochdale area. And my grandmother was sent to work in the mill when she was 14 and left school. She'd passed the 11 plus, but the whole issue of buying the uniform was such that she never went. And when my mother also passed the 11 plus, my grandmother was going to do the same thing, and her father intervened and said, no, we should let this chance happen, and find the money somehow. And that intervention was what completely changed my mother's life. And in fact, in a way, sort of almost changed it twice, because not only did she go to the grammar school and therefore got exposure to a whole raft of things she found incredibly exciting, including music. She was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and literature, which she was really passionate about, but also, she was a singer, and when her father died, just as she had got her place at university, and he was incredibly proud of her. And then he died on a Saturday, very close to her birthday. And she came back from helping out in the co-op to discover that he'd collapsed and died at a football match. And her first thought was, oh, well, obviously I can't go to university. There are 6 younger brothers and sisters. The money's not going to, I'm going to need to go out and earn. And her mother said, no, your father was so proud of you. You really have to go. So she went to Bedford College, and she did sociology, I think, rather than doing any arts subject, because she had a very strong sense that, her own social mobility, I think, made her very aware of the kind of lottery of social opportunity, and she was kind of really interested in that. And that she met my father, I think, as a postgraduate in Sheffield, although she was at the University of London as an undergraduate. And my paternal grandparents were teetotal Methodists, and my grandfather was he was a London taxi driver. They lived in Barnes, well, in Mortlake actually, and I think they weren't even primitive Methodists. There was something even odder. And my grandfather, who'd left school at 11, would go to Speaker's Corner at Hyde Park to attempt to convert the populace, because my grandmother wouldn't allow him to do it at the end of their road. So one of my early memories is of my granddad, whose faith was of the most straightforward kind, that meant that, for example, if he drove the wrong way down a one-way street, he didn't believe in one-way streets, God would look after him. Or if he pulled out into a road, nobody would run him over. And indeed, these things never happened. But whether God actually actively intervened, I wouldn't like to say. But he used to show me his sermons, because he was a Methodist local preacher. And because he was very anxious about having left school so early, he would get me to look through them to say, is the grammar right? Is the spelling right? Will it make sense? I suppose I was sort of 7 or 8. And he used to get me to play hymns to him.
Oh,
my grandmother was a much more kind of, she was sharper, she was very clever, she was extremely musical. She played the piano without having learnt formally, and I think they went to some sacrifices to make sure that my father learnt the piano, at which point she completely stopped playing, because the boy was learning proper stuff and she did proper stuff. But she was the clever one of the two, and also the more cynical one.
Right. And did they encourage your father David into education? Are you aware of?
Yes, they did, and they were incredibly proud of him. There was my father and his younger sister Audrey, but he was the boy with a capital B, and that was a kind of big thing. And he also passed the 11 plus and went to a East Sheen Grammar School, I think it was, where he was completely, he writes about it in his own autobiography, and I feel I'm slightly kind of ventriloquizing his words too crudely, but essentially he dreamed his time away. He read Wordsworth, he played the piano, he dreamed of being a concert pianist. He obliged with every possible church kind of music making there could be, and he didn't really practice his maths or do any of the things that meant that he would pass his higher education certificate. And to cut a long story short, he did find himself leaving school without the kinds of qualifications that could mean he could go to university. So he went to teacher training college, and then he did essentially he did a night correspondence course, which was how he ended up at the LSE. And all his life, I mean, my father never stopped working. It was as if for the whole of the rest of his life, he was afraid he might fall back into a dream of Wordsworth. And he wasn't going to let himself do that. So he was the most driven man I've ever known. And I don't think he ever really believed that he might not fall back into the outer darkness if he stopped working.
Really? Gosh. And was that something just that you noticed, or was that the texture of conversations that you had with him when it came to his work output?
I can't remember a time when I didn't know that my father was a driven man. And I can't remember a time when I didn't feel quite protective about him, because he was refused life insurance when he was in his early 30s. And he was because his blood pressure was high, and he was so terrified by this that he was convinced he was going to drop dead at any moment. And I can remember thinking, I mustn't annoy my dad because he will drop dead. He was nearly 90 when he died.
Gosh, he did remarkably well. Well, I say I met him as a much younger man before I did my PhD at a seminar at King's College London, and my memory of him is a very warm, affable, relaxed academic who I thought, I wish other academics I've met were like that. And I had a personal interaction with him. I was just about to start a PhD, and he was so engaging. And I wouldn't have picked up from that and the anecdotes he told that level of drivenness. It certainly didn't come out in his lecturing, or that I heard that time.
Well, I think he had an intellectual delight, and also, I mean, I should say that all the way through my childhood and adolescence and young womanhood, the house was filled with students that they were looking after or fostering in the intellectual sense, or just encouraging. They were a couple who sort of acquired extra kind of semi sons and daughters from all over the world through kind of teaching and research, and that went on being true, well, right up to the end, actually.
Gosh, wonderful. In the acknowledgements of your book, Holiness and Desire, you make a lovely tribute to your mother as the person, I quote it here, who taught me to think. Could you unpack that a little for us?
Sure. So when we were small, one of the things that was an absolute given of life was that there would be this time in the evening when my father and my mother would be talking about their work. And the form it usually took was that my father had written something, because you may have noticed that he wrote a good deal.
He certainly did. I did notice.
And he would read it out to my mother. Yeah. And my mother would listen to it, and then she would say, "You haven't made the connection clear between that point and that point. You've slid elliptically over this whole area. You're going to have to try and do it again." She was more than an editor. She was and is a rigorous thinker in a way that my father actually wasn't. My father did an awful lot intuitively. He had a kind of poetic mind, I think. But for my mother, although she is hugely sort of moved and stimulated and excited by the way that language works, it's much more analytical, and it's very, very logical. So that if you present an idea to her of the simplest or the most complex kind, she will take it apart and look at it, because that's her delight, really. And I can remember conversations with her when I was very, very little. So I can remember, for example, walking along a pier on a grey day somewhere in the north of England, I think maybe Blackpool, eating a little paper twist of, I think they were either whelks or little shrimps, which I'd never tasted before and I thought tasted wonderful. And I was asking her about hell, because hell was worrying me. And she said, here are some of the different things people think. And she laid out different kind of intellectual views about what hell might be, including some people think it happens, that hell is something that happens while people are still alive, that hell can only happen in this world and not in the next. And that was a totally new idea to me. And she just gave me these ideas to play with and think about. And I think I've always taken both ideas and life decisions to her, because she will be able to distinguish wheat from chaff in anything that somebody says. It's quite interesting watching her do it. It's totally dispassionate. She doesn't always think about how it's going to feel.
She sounds terrifying.
Oh, not at all. It's a part of being absolutely engaged in who somebody else is. So it doesn't feel like that at all.
Oh, wonderful. Amazing. So your father was a bit of a late developer by the sounds of it, and then was driven and intended never to go back to, and he didn't. His prodigious outputs, and that's a wonderful portrait of your mother there. Thank you. If I can ask, when it comes to your own thinking and your own approach to academics, are you a blend of the two, or do you lean more to one of your parents' approaches?
I think it is a blend, but it's also a tension. In that my mother wrote one book, which came out in 1980, and it's a remarkable book. And it's actually it's an analysis of contemporary culture, which I kind of feel Holiness and Desire is a sort of almost a continuation of. But the reason why she wrote one book and my father wrote 40 odd was because there was both because there was the difference between the person who brought up the 4 children and the person who didn't so much, but also because for my mother, how people are, who they are, and how they work, and what people's and relationships in general is a matter of the same precise attention. I'm not sure that there's I would follow her in feeling that there is not a clear distinction to be made between intellectual work and relationship work. They require the same kinds of attention and the same level of attention and the same intricacy and sensitiveness, and they meld into one another. I mean, just because we have genres, because genres are kind of convenient, and you can say this thing is literature and this thing is history, and this thing is sociology and this thing is the relationships that people have. They're all representations of relationships, actually, of different kinds, that just have structures that are rather different. So for my mother, once you've made that distinction sufficiently blurred, the question of whether you then fix it in record is a real question. Whereas for my father, I think he had a sense that if he didn't get it down and into print, it would all be lost. That there, it just sort of flew away. And I feel kind of quite conflicted between those two things. I felt and feel that if without that kind of intellectual inquiry being at the center of my life, I sort of pine, really. And the best way that I can sort out how I think or feel about something is to write it out and sort of get it clear that way, and preferably sort of as well and as clearly said as possible. So it's important that your prose is clear and open, and that it's not more occluded than it needs to be by terms of art. But as to the question of whether it is good for people to record everything that they are and everything that they do, or whether that's a kind of a response of anxiety, I wouldn't like to say. So I'm a bit, you know, I've got one foot in each camp, but I do feel that, you know, the ground moves between them quite a bit, and it's hard to keep my balance.
Gosh, wonderful, wonderful. And we'll come back to your book in a little bit, some more. Now, you've given us a very early childhood memory when you're 18 months old. But there's a beautiful recollection in Holiness and Desire about you playing with your younger brother on a carpet
Yes.
of blossoms, and really wanted to go back to that. I mean, you describe it yourself as paradisal.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about it for us, that memory?
It was in the house where we moved when I was 4, and where my mother still lives, actually, which had a sloping front lawn with a tree, which I think was probably a cherry tree, which produced those hanging kind of clusters of pink blossoms. Quite big, quite heavy clusters. And in the spring, they would all fall at once, and they literally covered the grass. So it was no longer green at all. It was completely pink. And I and my little brother, I don't know how old we would have been. It was probably quite soon after we moved. So I'm guessing we were 5 and 3, probably. And it was a Sunday morning, and we had to go to church, to the Trinity Methodist Church in Woking. And I really, really did not want to go. This is the bit I didn't say. In fact, I didn't want to go because, for all sorts of reasons, I didn't really enjoy the Sunday school. But also we had this marvelous game going, and I always drove what the games were about, just because I was older and I had more language. And we had this, I can't remember, I'm afraid, the details of what this fantasy was, but we were on a cloud, and we were doing various things on this cloud and traveling somewhere wonderful. And we were perfectly happy. I was really close to my younger brother before I learned to read. Once I learned to read, it was much more complicated. But this must have been just, I think perhaps books hadn't come between us quite as they did later on. And we were at one, playing this game, and just, there were so many blossoms, or this is how I remember it, there were so many blossoms that you couldn't get to the bottom of them. You were sort of kind of literally rolling around in them. One of my parents came and said we had to get in the car and go to church, and I regret to have to tell you that I behaved abominably.
So that memory has a different ending to the beginning.
It does, but as an early memory, it is one of absolute joy, in a way that, you know, is quite rare, even for small children. Total joy.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing a little more about that with us. Now, more prosaically, you've described yourself elsewhere as suburban.
Yes.
Moving from that wonderful image of blossoms to suburban. Could you unpack that for us as an identity for you? What does that mean for you when you say suburban?
Well, Woking is a satellite commuter town, which really only got any kind of its 19th century identity was really partly to do with being on the main line from London, and partly to do with the fact that Brookwood, the great 19th century necropolis, was just down the road. So all the coffins came along that line to Brookwood Cemetery. And when I was very small and we first moved to Woking, I can just about remember, only just, the sea of bowler hats going towards the station to go into London to do their whatever jobs it was they were doing that they wore bowler hats for. And that must be a really early memory, because bowler hats disappeared sometime in the 1960s. But it was, I mean, everybody knew, as I was growing up, everybody knew that Woking was a kind of non-place, a non-town. And when the Jams of Town called Malice came out, everyone went, oh yeah, that's the place we live. It's a very strange way to identify yourself, as coming from a place no one would want to come to.
I have a couple of friends from Woking, and it always has struck me as quite nondescript.
Yeah, quite so. And it's even more so now, where one of the jokes about Woking Council was that they were constantly ripping up what was there and rebuilding, and they did this all the way through my childhood and growing up. It looked different kind of every 3 or 4 years, because they rebuilt another bit, and then they were quiescent for about 20 years, but they appear to have started again. So I went home to see my mother sometime, about 18 months ago this must have been, and I walked from the station to our house. And as I went, I suddenly realised that I had navigated via a series of landmarks, all of which were gone.
Right, gosh.
There wasn't a single thing left of the things that I was using as my kind of mental map that was still standing.
Do you think those are middle-class cultural aspirations of Woking? So rather than some sort of palimpsest of building over the top of things where you could see development, the sheer removal of things. What do you think?
It's always been a total mystery to me what Woking Council was about. Completely strange.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Local authorities. I'm from Luton, grew up in Luton, so watched that place change tremendously over time, as working class things were torn down and replaced with middle class edifices, or economic aspirations for the city, and then all the other cultural things taking place there.
That's really interesting. I wonder if you're right. I mean, it was the little terraced houses and the library being in the Methodist chapel, and the former Methodist chapel. It was all the small stuff. When I first was in Woking, the tallest thing was Christ Church, the big city church, big charismatic city church, and now it's absolutely hidden by these enormous high rises.
Yes, well, from Woking to, can I come back to church experience? So, any other experiences of church growing up other than not enjoying Sunday school and not wanting to go there? Have you got any other memories of your church life when you were younger?
Well, we went to Woking Trinity Methodist Church, which was actually built in the early 1960s, and it was and is an extraordinary sort of octagonal concrete and glass building, with these sort of, I'm not meaning this rudely, these kind of sub-Chagall stained glass, including a a cross with an enormous eye in the middle. And I was reading The Lord of the Rings.
Eye of Sauron.
About this eye, I'm afraid.
Gosh.
But my brother was actually the very first baby to be baptized in Trinity Methodist Church. So there was that experience of church, which was very, you know, with hindsight, I realize it was a very kind of an optimistic view of where faith would belong in modernity. You know, you build a new church, you build a creche on the side of the new church. Your little brother is one of the first babies in the creche. It's a, you know, quite a thriving community. I had a Sunday school experience of a kind that's now very rare, with, you know, quite a lot of people in those Sunday schools. And if I dig right down, I realise that a lot of the things that I take for granted as kind of ordinary knowledge, or that I've built on in theological terms, go right back to, you know, colouring in those flat-roofed houses, or asking the Sunday school superintendent who Apollos was. And although I've been rude about it, and although, you know, I didn't really enjoy singing God of Iron, God of Steel, God of Piston and of Wheel, which I thought was a terrible hymn even then, don't think it's a very good hymn now either, I think it gave me quite a lot, actually, without me really realising it. And because my father and my granddad were both local preachers, so I was also going to the local Methodist church in Byfleet where my granddad preached, and I sang in the Methodist church choir. I can remember asking to stay in rather than going to Sunday school so that I could hear my dad preach. And I don't know what he preached about, but I do remember a picture, which I think must have been a New Jerusalem picture of, you know, sort of towers and spires covered in light. I was not, I don't think, a terribly easy person to have in Sunday school. I was very combative, difficult. And we stopped going to that church when I was 10 or 11, I suppose. And my parents weren't going to church anywhere. So I actually found my way completely by accident to Anglicanism when I was about 14. I was crossed in love, and I was walking down York Road in Woking to go into town. And I went past the St Mary of Bethany Church, and the doors were open, and there was this singing and light coming out, and I was really low. And I went in and I walked, unbeknownst, into a charismatic healing service, actually, which was the kind of thing, I have to say, my parents would have hated with a passion. They were very, you know, they liked things formal and contained, as indeed do I now. But that was the start of it, and I started going to that church of my own accord, following on from that experience, and owe it a lot, actually.
Can I ask you a little more about that experience? What were you cognizant of having happened to you? Or, I mean, if you've got this beautiful memory of joy and blossoms, how did you as a 14-year-old recall that experience in the church? Was it an experience of God? Was it warmth? Was there any joy there, or what was it that drew you back?
I'm only hesitating because I'm trying to disentangle what I thought then from all the layers. I can't remember a time when I wasn't aware of the presence of God. I can remember it from being very, very small. And that some of the things that I talk about in the looking chapter are about that sense of always being held in a gaze, and there being a kind of deep happiness somewhere there. I remember waking up when I was about 5 from a dream which I couldn't recall. I could only remember colours, which I knew was of absolute happiness. And I felt like that a lot as a very small child, and as I got older, it got much, much harder, as I'm sure it does for everybody. But I found that there were things about my primary school that I didn't find at all easy. And by the time I got to the age of 11, I was, I think, you know, with hindsight, not in a very good way mentally, actually, and really quite unhappy. And then when I reached 14, I was much happier at the grammar school, which then closed when I was 14, just because grammar schools were closing, and reopened as a comprehensive school, which my brother came to. But I had been really happy there, and some of the sort of contradictions of my life, some of the difficulties about being a kind of a dreamy person who was very good at English and terrible at maths and wanted to be a musician, and was incredibly sort of romantic with a small r, which just didn't fit with the world I was in. And adolescence sort of plonked on top of this. I was really low, and anxious and down at sort of 12, 13, 14. And so I was longing for something, for some sense of safety and reassurance. And when I went past that open door, that was what I went in for: safety and reassurance and a sense of being accepted and belonging, which was why it being a healing service was so helpful. I mean, that said, I was constantly hoping for and expecting some kind of some overwhelming spiritual experience, not just in church, but all the time. I wanted it, you know, in a greedy sort of way. You know, I'd go and I'd hope for sublime experiences by going and sort of looking at wonderful views or whatever it would be, and they very seldom happened in the way that you want. You know, in fact, they hardly ever happen when you expect them or look for them. And this was no different. I went once saying, you know, overwhelm me, I want to be changed, and it didn't happen. There was still another bit of me thinking, this is a very repetitive tune, and another bit of me when I went up for healing, which I did, thinking, you're making a terrible fool of yourself, why will this make any difference? Oh, look, it hasn't. But I went back and I went back and I went back, and actually I gradually built up a much more grounded sense of what it might be to live a Christian life, which again is, you know, at the bottom of the layers. So with hindsight, I think that church I went to, St Mary of Bethany Church, in those days, it was, you know, this was the 1970s and the charismatic revival was in full swing, and it had just arrived at that particular church. But it was in tension with an older kind of low church evangelical tradition that was quite undemonstrative. So we'd have these great long prayer sessions where, you know, one of the leaders would get up and go, oh, thank you, Lord, that we can dance and sing and show our love for you in any way we like. And then someone else would get up and say, but thank you, Lord, that we've got a little bit of decorum in the way that we do things. And they'd be actually sort of battling it out in the prayers that they were making. And, you know, I noticed those things, but they kind of didn't matter really. And the youth group was it was a grounding experience. I mean, I did actually get some help with spiritual resilience, I suppose.
Wonderful. See, my wife grew up in a Brethren church and has this deep grounding. I mean, her siblings absolutely hated church, but she loved it, loved Sunday school, loved the prayer meeting. I mean, I tried to count up the number of hours before we met at 18 when we did our theology degrees at London School of Theology. And she must have had well over 20,000 hours of Christian framing and contact. I didn't walk into a church until I was nearly 17.
Yeah.
And for me, it was a sort of coming home experience, as in I'd had experiences of God, but it's interesting when you don't have language to describe the noumenal. And I couldn't, but the moment I got into the church and someone gave me, I was like, oh, this is it. This is that feeling I have there. These are the words that explain what's been happening to me as a child. But I've always envied my wife's just that richness that's there, that she can always, in the hardest times, you know, the other day she'll hum something. I say, what are you humming? So it's an old Brethren hymn. You know, I don't have that to reach back for. So so thank you for unpacking that a little, just some of that richness to and I am mindful of your book that I'll get to ask you about, and it's helping me understand the way that you wrote it and how that you wrote it. So Jessica, pressing on a little, you talked about school, but with how aware of your parents' academic gifting were you, and did that put pressure on you at school? I mean, you painted this picture of someone who didn't like maths and
couldn't do maths
and wanted to read and things. Did that make things any more difficult for you at school?
Yes. The very first school I went to was a Montessori nursery school, and I was blissfully happy at this little school, which was mostly very, very young children and some older children with Down syndrome. And I remember it again as the most wonderful place. I didn't learn a thing there apart from how to make raffia baskets, which I now don't seem to be able to do. And my father taught me to read. But I had a brilliant time, and there were rabbits, and there was a bit behind the hedge where you could hide, and it was just a very safe, very warm place. And then I went to the local primary school a year after everybody else. So I suppose I was 5 when I went. And it was a very big shock. It was a totally different and much grimmer experience from day one. And in fact, I was taken home in disgrace on the very first day because I was too frightened to ask anybody where the loos were.
Oh.
With dire consequences, I'm afraid. And my very first teacher was, I experienced her as an extremely frightening person. And she asked me if I could read, and I said I could, which was true. I was reading fluently by then. So she gave me a book which only had a couple of words on each page. And I went away and I read it, and I brought it back and I said, I've read it, what should I do now? And she didn't believe me. And things kind of went on from there. Not very well. And also, I was very, very good at a couple of things. I was really good at anything to do with words, and I was really good at anything to do with music, and I was terrible at anything to do with numbers. My mind would go blank. And they had these kind of number rod things, and even with the number rod things, or perhaps because of the number rod things, I was still totally bothered about whether you counted naught as a number or not, because it made a difference of one whether you did.
Yeah.
And I still find I worry about that occasionally. So that I think they couldn't make sense of someone who was only good at a few things but was really good at them. And at the same time, so that's school, but at the same time at home, I don't think pressure is quite the right word, because I gobbled up everything I was given very eagerly. But I think I was aware, particularly in relation to my father, that for him there was a kind of vicariousness about everything I had and could do. So the piano lessons and he took me to concerts when I was small. I remember him taking me to Handel's Jephthah when I was about 7 or 8, which is an odd choice, as it's about sacrificing your daughter to God. But there you go. And taking me to see Kirite Kanoa play and to Beethoven's Fifth, and these were wonderful occasions because I was there on my own with my dad and being grown up and going to these amazing places. And he took me to the LSE and pointed out. I remember him pointing out a guy who he explained had been an anthropologist in Brazil who didn't, it has to be said, seem very, very comfortable in a suit. And I suppose I had this sense of an awful lot of hope invested in me doing well, and I think I felt it not so much with the word stuff, which just was easy, but with music. I can't remember learning to read music. My dad taught me to read music, and I can remember sitting there and him going, this is G, B, D, F, this is A, C, E, this is what they look like in the treble stave, and this is what they look like in the bass stave, and now start trying to put them together. I do not remember the process of learning that. But I started to wonder how I could continue to fulfill that promise. Promise is easy, but the fulfillment's hard work, and it seemed to be in too many different directions for me to keep on top of it all. I didn't know whether, I thought I wanted to be a musician for quite a lot of my teenage years.
Yeah. And because your father was very musical, an accomplished amateur pianist.
That's right.
And you played several instruments.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what you played and what you enjoyed playing?
I started off with the piano. My dad started me off, and then I started having piano lessons. And then I don't know why I did this, but they started offering free violin lessons at school. And I started learning the violin at school, and I was too scared to tell my parents. I have no idea why at this distance. Of course, it came out in the end, and they were very cross, but they were very cross that I hadn't told them. So I have no idea what that was about. But I was not very good at the violin. I didn't get on with it, and my brothers teased me about how awful it sounded. So I gave that up, and I started playing the oboe when I was, you have to be a bit older to play the oboe, just because the breath control. And I took to that very quickly and very easily, and I was playing in the grammar school orchestra within sort of weeks of starting to learn. And it was a very musical grammar school, so I went to endless schools proms, where the schools would go to the Albert Hall and they would do a concert together, and then it would end with the Land of Hope and Glory, and you'd have a kind of proms experience but for schools. I went to that year after year, I think, in the late 70s. And I thought I wanted to be an oboist, and I played in Youth Orchestra and stuff. But at the same time, of course, there was, my older brother was playing the guitar, and he showed me basic chords, and I taught myself to play the guitar, though I never really learned how to use a plectrum properly. And girls didn't play the guitar then. I mean, they were beginning to, but on the whole, they didn't.
Yeah.
So an abiding memory of my teenage years is of showing lots of boys how to play particular solos from particular records. Fantastic. And showing them the fingering and not ever doing it myself.
Brilliant. It's funny you said, like, you were selected for these musical lessons. I have a memory. I'm a little younger than you, so I grew up in Luton in a state school, but in primary school, because I'd played the recorder, and for some reason I was identified as having. I do remember being called into a room and asked how I'd learned to read music, and I'm like, well, it's easy. Yeah. And I think some reason, and then I got. Next thing I know, I've got a peripatetic violin teacher, a violin provided. My working class parents were sort of thought it was I remember thinking they were sort of proud of me, but thought it was culturally very strange. But it opened up a whole world to me. Yeah, like I'm hearing you talk. I remember those, go away and for a week practice in an orchestra, and sometimes we'd have people from the London Philharmonic Orchestra come and sit next to you, and then there'd be a big concert at the end of it. And then I got into county orchestras, and it was I mean, I must admit, as a late teenager, I struggled demographically and culturally with the people. I couldn't bridge the gap between my working class roots as I got older, but to this day, that richness of what that put into life. I as soon as you said that, I thought, there was that strange thing where suddenly people were being given lessons and instruments, and
and then there's this whole world that you sort of get pitched into, which is, and it's almost like a conveyor belt. You go into the county orchestra, and then because of the county orchestra, you do this and this and this and this, and you play with this quartet or whatever, and it's amazing. But it's also kind of, did I choose this? I don't remember choosing this.
It sort of happens to you. You're inducted into it. It was beautiful. And I remember a residential called Netherswell Manor for some reason. I should probably still exists, but you felt like a coach trip that took forever to the middle of nowhere, probably in Gloucestershire or somewhere, and you'd spend a week sequestered with and then they bring in some expert people to come and play with you.
We went to a place called Gatton Park, which was
Gatton Park. I remember as a teenager, a hot house of intensive practice and teenage hormones. It was
absolutely
an awful residential food, as things were. They seemed to be awful back then. Oh, well, thank you. That helps me situate you really well. If I can come to your adolescent self, and in Holiness and Desire, you point out how complicated things were in public life with regard to sexual behaviours between the 1960s and 70s, and the transformation in attitudes and behaviours and responsibilities and everything at many levels, and was struck by you highlighting that the informal contract between men and women, how that changed. Could you just unpack a little bit about what that was like for you as a Woking teenager, sort of at the I mean, if you said Woking was nondescript, but it certainly fits the sort of, it's the perfect place, isn't it? The epicenter for that 1960s to 90s transformation that you talked about.
Yeah. Afraid so. What was it like? Well, it was a bit much, really. I found it very, very difficult. I'm not sure I kind of coped with it all that well. Well, I didn't cope with it very well. The way it felt was that you thought you were just kind of a person, around other people until you were about 11 or 12. And then suddenly you realized you weren't a person, you were a sort of walking bomb. Because you triggered responses in other people that were completely inexplicable, and which you couldn't control or defend yourself against very easily. So just by walking down the street, you'd make stuff happen that you had never meant or intended or wanted. And I can actually remember the very sort of first moment that I felt that. And I was suppose about 12, and my body was just beginning to change, and I was playing on a slide with my younger brothers, and someone who was visiting my parents, an older man, made a remark, and I can't remember what the remark was, but it was about the change in my shape, and there was this sort of appreciative snigger, kind of communal snigger amongst this group of men watching us play. And I thought, I was suddenly really taken aback, and thought, I need to be careful. I didn't think I need to be careful because I didn't know what to think, but I knew something had happened. And then coming back from a ballet class, actually, so with my hair scraped back and stuff on over leotard and tights and ordinary shoes on, I met a terrified young man, young Asian man, on the way home, who held that £5 note to me and made it clear what he wanted, and clearly thought I was 13. He clearly thought I was much older. And we gazed uncomprehendingly at each other, and I wouldn't take the money and walked on. But I found it terrifying. I mean, he was more frightened than I was, if possible. But it was just, my goodness, what did he see when I thought I was still a child? And of course, in those days, it was absolutely normal to be walking through a kind of cloud of wolf whistles, remarks. It was completely normal. So, for example, I didn't talk about this in the book in an explicit way, and I won't now. But, for example, the school where I was had a completely separate house where all the practice rooms were, with the pianos in them, and I used to spend a lot of time in those practice rooms because I did, but also because I was skipping games classes. It was a good place to hide. But to get there, you had to get through to run the gauntlet of the kitchen at the bottom, which had a member of staff in it, who was a male member of staff, and who, if you were a girl, wasn't going to let you through unless. It was really difficult, and it would never have occurred to me to go and tell anybody. And I found a way to trick him, and I'm not sorry.
Thank you. I mean, it's funny. My recollection of as a child, so I was born at the end of the 60s. I remember the clear link. As I was reading through your book, it prompted me that we are my grandparents' generation. Sex meant babies, and in my working class family, there's just babies all over the place. But I picked up pretty quickly as I became an adolescent, the power of what contraceptives allowed for, and very different experiences of my parents, had compared to my grandparents, and what that made possible. And then the turmoil that you go through, and you talk about, what you wouldn't think to report. I have one recollection of one teacher who touched me incredibly inappropriately, but I would never have thought to tell my parents, a male teacher. I don't remember an environment in which anybody ever talked about anything. And I say, the wolf whistle. I remember I had to ask my mother, why are those men doing that? And she said, that's just what I know. As soon as you said that, I remember saying, that's just what men do. That's what they seemed to do in the 1970s, didn't they? Like, is that what I have to do when I become a man?
Yeah.
Strange.
I remember watching my mother put makeup on when I was a small child and thinking, oh, that looks such a pain. Do I have to do that when I'm grown up?
Oh gosh, that's funny. Thank you. If we move on a little bit from your teenage years, so with your academic background, was it assumed that you were going to go to university? Was that just an assumption? And can you tell us then how you decided what you were going to study and where? Obviously, maths wasn't in the offing.
It wasn't going to be maths. In fact, that I have a maths O-level is entirely down to one dedicated teacher who said, I'm tired of you looking out of the window and thinking about your trombone. I'm going to make you do this, and sat me down after school. I was
going to ask, because where you, for your academic career, you must have had to achieve a maths qualification of some sort. So that's answered.
So I do have one.
Well done.
It's the O-level I'm proudest of, and the one with the lowest mark. Yes, I think it was absolutely assumed I would go to university. That said, there was this dream of music college as well. And in fact, I had an interview for the Yehudi Menuhin School when I was 11, and I didn't get in. I was desperate to go. I was really unhappy in my last year of primary school, and this looked like an escape. And my best friend at school had gone there, and I wanted to follow him, but I didn't get in, and I couldn't get over this, that I hadn't got into this school. And in my teens, I was still very much flirting with, going to one of the Royal Schools of Music, becoming an oboist, or I wasn't quite sure what I would do with it. And I can kind of remember I wondered about doing something with the piano, which I knew was really probably impossible. And all the way through, I think it must have been my O-level year, actually, I did nothing but practice. And I got a ridiculously good Associated Board result that year for a grade that I took. But somehow that achievement, I kind of knew that was where it was going to stop at some level. And when I went off to the sixth form college, even though, I did 2 music A-levels, which you could do in those days. You could do a practical one and a theoretical one, and I did both. And I thought, I actually don't think I can bring myself to spend the rest of my life doing what will actually happen, which will be that I will do the symphony orchestra repertoire, and I'll talk about making reeds with other oboists, and I don't think I can bear it. I'm not going to do this. Perhaps actually it's got to be words. And I applied to Cambridge thinking, well, there's lots of music going on at Cambridge. So I applied to be an instrumental scholar, and I got in both in the entrance exam and as an instrumental scholar. And then I got pregnant. So I had to give it up. And I went the next year.
You went the next year. So you went to Trinity Hall in Cambridge,
That's right.
didn't you, in the end? So what was that like for you, rather than just stumbling over that and running in to Cambridge, not going and then going a year later? What did that do to your experience of studying at Cambridge?
There are bits of your life where you wish you'd done it again and better. And there are bits of your life when you knew you did it dreadfully, but you couldn't have done it any better. And you wouldn't want to do it again. And it was one of those,
Right.
really.
Yeah.
What can I say? I have very sort of split feelings about it, because it was both marvelous and terrible. There were things about it that really were marvelous. There was the kind of the excitement of just the stuff we were doing and reading and writing, and having that freedom. You spend your time at school. Well, I spent my time at school trying to pretend I didn't read anything, because that was how you survived. And suddenly it wasn't nobody hated you for it. So that was really nice. And I met Francis. I should have been in his year, but I was the year behind because I came a year later. And I met other people who've been, lifelong friends. And a whole world opened up that was unimaginably rich and extraordinary. So that's one side, and it's all completely true. And then there's the other side, which is that I'd never cooked a meal. I'd never paid a bill. I wasn't in college. I was in a little graduate flat, which, I was very grateful for, which was about a mile down the road. I had a 10-month-old with me, who I'd never looked after on my own, because I'd been at home with my parents till then. And there were not only were there no other parents that I came across, student parents that I came across, but they weren't even used to there being women there. So my very first term, I was in a supervision group being taught by somebody who was so horrified at teaching women that he literally could not look us in the eye, or greet us in the street. So to be in that environment with a baby, so kind of doubly embarrassing, and it was just such hard work. The kind of the no sleep, the fact that to have any kind of social interaction at all with people, I had to do so much around the outside of it. I had this sort of quixotic and mad plan that I wasn't going to cost my parents more than I would have cost them anyway if I hadn't had the baby. So I was living on rice in stock, and feeding my daughter on baby food. And actually, I can remember Francis, who I met at university, coming round with a shopping bag full of stuff and saying, "This is ridiculous. I am going to cook you spaghetti bolognese, and I'm going to do it now. And I'm going to fill your fridge with things like orange juice." Which was great. I mean, he'd had a nannying job in his year off, so he wasn't so fazed by the whole baby side of things as a lot of my, not all my contemporaries, but a lot of them were. And also, although this sounds like a really small thing, it wasn't. Everybody assumed I must be really sexually experienced because I turned up with a baby, and in fact, when I'd just been really inept and stupid.
Gosh. So I'm trying to imagine what that was like for you as a very young woman with a baby to navigate. It must have been easier to have contemplated. I'm sure you did contemplate not going, but you've mentioned before, you used the word, I think you used the word resilience, where you got some of your resilience from and your grounding earlier on in life. Were you aware of that resilience kicking in at this point? How deep did you have to dig? What was it like with your parents because that's a huge undertaking to make, isn't it? To go through this experience and go to university.
It never crossed my mind not to go to university. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it, but I had a belief that I could do anything if I just worked long enough hours. I actually think this is not true now, but at the time, it was very let it all come. I can do anything, and I don't really need sleep, and that was the severest test of my I can do anything that I've ever had. You know, when I think about the way that I navigated the last years of school, I was a very divided person, actually. So there was one part of me that was doing academic achievement and, you know, playing in all these orchestras and kind of fulfilling all that stuff. And there was another bit of me that was getting more and more rackety and seeing stranger and stranger groups of people socially and, you know, going on the backs of people's motorbikes and behaving increasingly riskily, I think. And I don't think the two were talking to each other very well. Well, they weren't. And I saw it as a kind of eclecticism. I was proud of being able to span all these different contexts. And it was a way of trying to belong and trying to be part of as many worlds as I could manage. But I had lost control of it by the time I got pregnant. And in fact, getting pregnant was it was a symptom of having lost control of my life in a way. And it meant that I had to do a complete reset. And that was very, very hard to do. And once you've started sort of flying apart, putting yourself back together is really, really difficult. Also, I think I should say that I was extraordinarily fueled by what I read. So I had, you know, I'd read as many Hardy novels as you care to name, and I didn't know whether this was going to be one of the tragedies or one of the comedies, but I knew I had to do it as hard as possible.
Right. Well, in terms of a cast of characters at university, so Francis has appeared and stocked your fridge and given you some orange juice. We have a tutor lecturer who can't look you in the eyes and engage with you because you're a woman. But were there any other people who stood out at university, faculty or people from your experiences there that were important to you in that time?
Oh, yes. Yeah. The other close friend that I made was someone called Edmund Duval, who's now a ceramicist. And he and Francis had known each other as children, but I'd met him at a wedding when I was pregnant, but I didn't know it. And we'd discovered we were going to go to the same college, and then actually we ended up being in the same year and doing English together. And he is, you know, an old friend and is my younger daughter's godfather, and was a real kind of I felt he saw me rather than what I was. I think one of the things that did happen at university quite a bit to me was that there were the students, and then there was the one with the baby, and we mustn't expect the one with the baby to do all that well, because after all she's got a baby, and young mothers with babies, you can't have intellectual expectations of them, and there was quite a lot of that. So I was really pleased to get a first. And there was also a bit of me going, right, that showed you to a number of people. But there was somebody who took me for supervisions in Renaissance literature in my second year, who was just an extraordinarily vivid and thoughtful teacher, a man called Stuart Eames. And he introduced me to John Donne, and he also introduced me to Isaac Walton's Life of Donne. I ended up writing a PhD about early modern life writing, and particularly writing the lives of clergy. And Isaac Walton's lives of Donne and Herbert and Hooker and Robert Sanderson and Henry Wotton were right in the middle of that PhD. And I can remember the excitement of that term, which was partly, very much to do with the excitement of what I was being taught, but also had this extraordinary experience of being taken seriously, which had not happened up to then. And then in my third year, I was sent for supervisions in the modern literature paper with a fellow of Trinity called Eric Griffiths, who died just a couple of years ago. And he was a sort of enfant terrible and an extraordinary teacher, and took absolutely no prisoners. He could be very cruel. He was analytically extraordinarily precise, and he was very observant about how people read and wrote. And being taught by him was life transforming. I didn't actually see his difficult side at that point at all. He was an unstintingly generous teacher, and he became both a dear friend and a colleague later on.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. And can I ask you what the texture of your faith was like at this point, all the way through this experience, just before going to university, through university? What was happening there for you?
It was a bit confused. I was organ scholar for a bit of this time, just for a year, and then I resigned because I actually couldn't do it, and the baby. That was one of my moments of, oh, you do have limitations. A very useful lesson, actually. So I was going to chapel in a kind of in a musical capacity all the time, but I think, as far as faith was concerned, I was, I'd been in this sort of evangelical bubble, and the terms of that bubble didn't include having a baby. So at the point where I got pregnant, I just fled. I jumped before I was pushed, really, and I was so relieved to get out. And so there was a breadth and a generosity about the world that I went into, the student world that I went into, that I'd never, ever found before, particularly in the sort of the roles of men and women between and among themselves were much more equal and freer and less inimical, I suppose, than I had ever experienced. I mean, as far as I was concerned, all relationships with a man would be, you might find your way to a mutual understanding, but it would always be like learning to understand your enemy, because they would, you know, they in the end did not wish you well. They might wish to wish you well, but they couldn't.
Right.
And I think university was the first time where I discovered that you could have relationships where everybody wished everybody else well. And rightly or wrongly, I think wrongly now, of course, I associated that with relative freedom from church strictures, which in some ways sort of reinstantiated that kind of standoff between men and women.
Thank you. Now, at some point in your 20s, I understand you spent some time as a speechwriter to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie.
That's right.
How did you arrive in that role?
I went to the careers service.
Right. Yeah.
That's sorry. That's the wrong way to reply. So
I tried to imagine you going to the career service saying you'd be a perfect script writer for an Archbishop of Canterbury.
No, it wasn't quite like that. But so I got a British Academy grant to do a PhD, and in those days, going into graduate work was like falling out of the world. You would go from a very structured, you know, 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 supervision system with lectures, not that I went to any really, and seminars, into a world where nobody cared whether you got up in the morning. So it was, and where you were for the first time doing something long form and you didn't know how. You didn't begin to know how. And the person I had as a PhD supervisor was immensely learned, gentlemanly, courteous, kindly. But his gentlemanliness came out in an unwillingness ever to say that the person he was talking to didn't know what he knew. So he couldn't actually impart any information because it might imply that you didn't already know it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So we would have these wonderful kind of conversations, courtly conversations, in which he carefully concealed from me all the things I knew I didn't know. And occasionally sort of threw out winsomely a book I might consider, which was usually somewhere on the outlier part of the reading list. And I was absolutely lost, really. And in the middle of all this, I don't know quite how much to say, but anyway, I got re-involved with somebody I had first met at the United Reformed Church Youth Club when I was 13, who was the reason I got pregnant. I had this kind of crazy notion that I was going to make it all neat and right again by, you know, starting that relationship again. And it was the most disastrous and destructive thing I've ever done. But one of the side effects of this was that I inherited I had started a relationship with someone who was in considerable debt. And I didn't actually know that until the bailiffs came knocking, at which point I realised that I was about to become responsible for another person's debts, thousands and thousands of pounds worth of debt from before I had, started this relationship. So I wasn't really quite sure how to handle this, and I already knew from the way the relationship was going that it would be unrealistic to think that this person was going to pay them himself, or even begin to pay them himself, or even have a regular job to kind of pay the bills. So I had to think about, whether being a student was really going to work, and it seemed to me it was not. So I went to the careers service, and I saw this post for research assistant and speechwriter, and I thought maybe I can do that. It's got a salary that looks like a lot of money to me. It's about 10,000 a year, I think. And I went and I got this job. And I then had a hallucinatory 12 months in an abusive relationship, a violent relationship, cut off from all family and friends, because that's what happens with those sorts of relationships. Not able to get on top of the debt in spite of what seemed like a huge sum of money coming my way. If you've got a hole at the bottom of your bucket, it doesn't matter what you put in the top. With an increasingly frightened and uncertain daughter who was seeing stuff she shouldn't see, and at the same time trying to kind of keep up appearances in a job in Lambeth Palace. So I was split again, really, in a way that I had never really meant, but it was happening. I wasn't on top of. I think I would have been bad at the job anyway. I think you need to be quite a lot older to sort of ventriloquize somebody else in the way that job required. But I certainly wasn't any good at it as somebody who wasn't getting any sleep and was constantly frightened. And I was gradually, I talked about in the book, sort of losing skills. That was happening. And so I did that for about a year. And then a sort of breaking point came, and I did the sort of classic thing, and I stole the keys off the sideboard, and I packed a couple of plastic bags, and I ran away. And it took a couple of years of continually running away, because this was 1990, so it was before the Children Act. It was at a point where the police did not take domestic violence at all seriously. So the very first time I called the police did not come round to me first. They visited this other person, and he said, "Oh, she makes terrible fuss. Don't worry about it." So they didn't. They didn't. And it took really quite a long time and some other things to happen before they took it at all seriously. But in the course of that, as you might expect, I can't even remember. I think I went and said, I can't go on doing this job. But I suspect that I only anticipated them saying, you can't go on doing this job by days, probably. So I had, it must have been at least 18 months, and it might have been 2 years on income support, moving from house to house, because it took me a little while to work out that getting injunctions simply sends someone your address. And eventually I moved back to Cambridge. I got a sort of one of those pro rata visiting jobs with the Roehampton Institute, and then I became a tutor for the Open University, and I finished my PhD, and I applied for a postdoc at Lucy Cavendish College, and I got it. And at that point, I was kind of climbing back up into somewhere with some security. It was, in some ways, it wasn't hard in the way that running away had been hard, but financially, the most difficult time was when I was earning something, so I wasn't getting benefits, but I wasn't being paid often enough to have any money at all. So, we just had no money. We had no money. And just making the food stretch to the end of the week was a kind of, it was an achievement I was proud of.
It's
got easier after that.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, my background's different to yours, but working class and I had to put myself through my degree because I couldn't get a grant and paid for my wife. I think I did 16 different student jobs at one point. But I remember and I had babies very early on, got married at 21. And I do remember the ignominy. It came to mind the other day of not my groceries when I went to pay for them. I think I'd missed out the payment date by a day or something anyway, and being at Sainsbury's surrounded by people when you can't pay for your groceries.
Yeah.
As a young child. And I remember that deep sense of shame that I felt of trying to provide. I can feel a little of the texture. I keep using that word of what it must have been like for you to keep going through this time. And so your PhD is interrupted, but you complete it. And if I can frame a question for you, I wonder how you said so beautifully earlier on, something along the lines of, there are things that you do, you shouldn't have done. And there are just terrible things that you went through and you wouldn't ever want to go through them again, but you bring something good out from them. You said it much more wonderfully than that. So I'm just wondering about your PhD. When you finally finished it, I'm sure it took longer than you had anticipated, hoped, or wanted.
Yeah.
But was there anything at the end of it, because of what you had been through, that shaped the final output, either of who you were, or, you got to look at it and go, there is something different about this because of what I've been through and the journey I've been through to complete it?
I think I thought about it in two different ways. So some of it was just about it as purely and simply as symbol. Doing the PhD was a way of saying, I'm not going to be destroyed or defeated by the consequences of what I've been and gone and done. I'm going to find a way to do what I have it in me to do. So when I left that night with my 7-year-old who was actually ill as well, so she was feverish and sicky. One bag had sort of Calpol and her clothes and some other bits and pieces in it, but the other bag had all my notes, and some of that was rational. I thought he might destroy them because he knew it mattered. Some of it was just, what are the most important things? Okay, it's my daughter and my notes, and the rest I can leave behind. So that was purely symbolic. It wasn't anything to do with the content of the PhD. It was just the fact of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
The PhD itself sounds, it sounds terribly kind of separated from real life, because what it was it's got some awful kind of title so unmemorable I can't actually remember it properly, but it was about the roots of literary biography in the commemorations, largely of clergymen, that were done in the early modern period. So from, I suppose, about 1500 to the 1680s. So I read an awful lot of funeral sermons because they were the sort of version of what became biographical prefaces to sermons, and then those turned into sort of biographies in their own right, and then Boswell read those. So that's the progression. And I really think that I'm very interested in people's lives anyway. I think this kind of oral history project is incredibly interesting. And I've always been very interested in things like the Mass Observation Project. So I wanted to know about people's lives. And in fact, the way that early modern lives happen, it's an exemplary formula, really. So it's the ways in which you conform to a set of scriptural kind of exemplar, or a set of classical exemplar, or it's but it generates a way it generates an imitative way of living as well. So I was finding examples of people who may or may not have begun each day by singing a song to God of praise upon the lute, but definitely generated people who then did do that because they'd read about it and they thought that that person had done it, whether they had or not. So I thought that was it started off by asking the question, why, since Isaac Walton must have known that some of the things he said about his subjects weren't true, he wrote them down as if they were true and appeared to believe them. So I was trying to look at kind of what the criteria for trustable narrative, trustable non-fictional biographical narrative even could be, which I still think is a really interesting question, given all the slipperiness of how people remember and of how things get told and of what consonance things that the stories of people's lives are with what they think they should remember, or with models of what lives are like, or with particular genres, whether they're genres of suffering or genres of redemption or genres of despair. They have their trajectory, and it's how you follow it or don't. But the other thing it did was it made me read a lot of 17th century devotional prose, frankly. And I think it was a kind of conversion experience, which is quite funny because it was reading about conversion experiences reasonably often as well. But it asked the question over and over again, what should a priest be to those who watch him? And I saw that question being asked over and over again from just before the Reformation to just about kind of the Glorious Revolution, I suppose. That was and I discovered it was a question in which I was quite interested and still am.
So in the midst of any sort of hagiography and analysis of, using templates for presentations of idealized forms of conversion, it sounds like you discovered something authentic in the midst of all the stories to resonate with you at that level. What ultimately is, I suppose, a question I'd ask is what are the marks of authenticity in all those stories? How did you smell the authenticity and know that it was it the analytical part of you that you talked about, or was it the poetic part of you that saw the poetic truths?
Well, I suppose because the center of what I was looking at was Isaac Walton, the thing about Isaac Walton was that he was just a bloke, really. He'd been to grammar school, but he hadn't been to university. He was a lay person. He was, I don't want to overplay it, but the reason why he ended up writing The Life of Donne was really basically because he knew Donne, not because he was the obvious hagiographer. And so he really valued anything that was to do with propinquity, anything about someone who had known what somebody else was like. I think that's why Boswell liked him so much, because that's of course what Boswell ended up doing in spades. Was, it was all about what you saw, about being very close to the person and seeing all the detail. So Walton's biographies are a kind of hybrid. Yes, there's a bit of that sort of hagiographical background, well, quite a lot of it, I suppose, but there's also the particularity of what someone's like. So, right in the middle of a very kind of peculiarly unlikely scenario of Donne's deathbed behaviour, although he may well have done it because he was such a performer, you suddenly discover him saying, the doctor told him that he would get better if he just drank milk, and he said he'd rather die. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but that's more or less what it says. And suddenly there's this person saying, "You must be joking! I'm not drinking milk." So it's something about the particularity of people as against the kind of the frames that they inhabit that interests me.
Yeah, and that led you to this authenticity around conversion. So again, if I can just lean into that a little bit with you, what does conversion mean? And again, you have, I believe, sorry, I need to get more to your book, but conversion, is it the converting at the end of the book? How were you changed? How were you converted during that process by the end of it? Were you aware of that?
I don't think I was very aware of it, because it was slow. And it was people talk about a change of heart as if it was a change of heart. I had started in the 90s. When would it have been? So I started going back to church. And I was certainly, so I was part of that, I put myself in the way of that discipline of being, of regular kind of worship. And I've always been very kind of rather literally mindedly responsive to what I read. And I was reading these kind of accounts of very disciplined devotional lives, Lancelot Andrewes' 5 hours of prayer and before he starts the business of the day, and Thomas Jackson's sort of not being allowed out by his housekeeper with change in his pockets because he would give it all away. And and actually, yes, they're hagiographical in one sense, but actually these were also literal minded people who were doing these extreme things because you lived or died by this stuff. If you're looking at early modern religion, you're looking at people who believe what they believe against very considerable odds, and danger of death or imprisonment or ostracism, or all kinds of things that we don't have to deal with personally ourselves. And it's, you know, I read a lot of Fox's Book of Martyrs. I read a lot of Catholic martyrology. You know, you can't help but be profoundly affected by Edmund Campion saying to his companions the night before he dies, "We are to be made a spectacle unto angels and men." And he said it in Latin. Because you know what's about to happen is unimaginably awful. And yet there's this extraordinary self-possession in talking about it in that way. So I was just really profoundly affected by what I was reading and started to find myself in, you know, limping ways, putting it into practice. And at some point in this, I think possibly after I got the PhD, but when I was still sort of trying to turn it into a book, I discovered Anglo-Catholicism via the, you know, the local Anglo-Catholic church. So I was held by this very intricate structure of behaviour and observance. You know, the daily office, the daily Eucharist, the round of saints' days, the very considerable participation of the congregation actually in an Anglo-Catholic setting. You know, whereas High Anglicanism, where I am now, you know, congregation doesn't get to do an awful lot because the choir's doing it all really. But where I was, we sang everything, or you know, we made the gestures, we did all the. It wasn't friendly to women's ordination, but that kind of, I didn't care. I wasn't about to get ordained at that point, I didn't think, and it held me at a time when I really needed those bonds. I needed to learn the discipline of living devotionally. And I picked it all up from these early modern texts. A lot of it.
Wonderful. Gosh, that's just astonishing. You mentioned ordination of women. I was just about to move on to your academic career at Cambridge, but let me ask you about ordination. When you were, if you can remember any of your speeches that you were ventriloquizing for Robert Runcie, was the subject of ordination of women one that you had to write about?
All the time.
Yeah.
In fact, I used to get a little bit of quiet fun out of it because, of course, they didn't know they were writing to me. So I'll get these kind of spluttering letters from people saying, "Oh, how can you do this?" Or, you know, slightly more measured letters saying, look, if you do this, all the bonds you've made with the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church will all kind of go to hell. And is that really what you want? Is it worth it just, you know, to let the women have what they want and so on? And I would write back as him.
Oh gosh, wow.
I think you have no idea who's writing to you.
I mean, was that just dusted off and sent in the post, or would he glance?
Oh no, absolutely not. No. I wasn't doing anything off my own back.
Right. Yeah.
Really. But I was, and in fact, I mean, if it was a complex letter, the chaplain would have to handle it. But I read quite a bit of stuff, one way and another.
Anything in particular that stays with you from that time about the complexities of ordination of women, the wranglings, the arguments, the postulating, the convictions?
I didn't have very much kind of energy to spare to worry about it. I thought it was mildly absurd, but I think for the whole of my life, I have been able to hold together completely contradictory understandings of what it is to be a woman. Both that I am, you know, as able and as kind of competent as any man might be at anything I might put my hand to, assuming I had any natural talent for it in the first place. And that it is an absolute kind of given law of life that if you're a woman, you will be in the background. You know, at the very bottom, that's what I think. And I don't believe it. I don't put my, you know, it's not a conviction of mine. It's just an assumption that I can't get rid of. So it's, and it's because it's what came to me in the world. So I could simultaneously feel that it was an injustice that was being done to women, and that it was also just how the world was, and there was not much point kicking about it. It's like the way, you know, when you're a child and you're reading narratives, if you're a girl and you were reading the sort of books that were coming out in the 1970s, which is an absolute kind of golden age of children's literature, you have to spend an awful lot of your time being a boy. You know, I read the Henry Treece, I don't know if you ever read them, but the Henry Treece Viking trilogies, they're probably just a little bit before your time. But anyway, they're a trilogy of, you know, you follow these Vikings, you know, they go to Byzantium and they sack various monasteries, they do this and that, but you see it from their perspective, and they're, you know, they're heroes, they're great. Well, I followed them round Europe, these Vikings, as a girl, by imagining myself as a boy. So that's what you do. You sort of think yourself into. So I was kind of, and at that time, I was thinking myself into being Archbishop of Canterbury and knowing I wasn't. So there was a little bit of me thinking, this is ridiculous. And there was another bit of me thinking, well, it will mess up the relationships with the Orthodox Church as well.
Yeah. Gosh, fascinating. Well, so many questions I could ask, but we haven't got time for. So let's move on to your academic career and how that happened at Cambridge. You've already talked in passing when we were talking about you finishing up your PhD. You were doing some postdoc grad tutoring at Lucy Cavendish, weren't you?
That's right.
And then you were doing something. Were you doing something at Roehampton Institute?
Was before, yeah. So I was a visiting lecturer at Roehampton, yeah. Which is a really grand title for being brought in to offer a module.
Right.
Yeah. That's it was really I got given a research fellowship at Lucy Cavendish, which was wonderful. So I was there for 5 years, and of those, 4 of them were this postdoc, which was a research postdoctoral position. And in that time, I didn't do quite what I was meant to do, but I did turn my PhD into a book, and it came out from the OUP, which is, you know, that's the desideratum for, you know, how you can ever get an academic post if you've got your monograph out there and from a good press. And yeah, so that happened, not without some setbacks, but with much help, it happened. But at the same time, I was offered, I mean, really just so that I could, as a way of helping me kind of stay on there, I divided my time between this research post and being the graduate tutor. So I looked after all graduate admissions and graduate pastoral care, and was part of that senior team. And at the same time, I'd started to get re-involved in teaching English for Cambridge, in terms of supervision, but also in offering lectures and things. And a post came up at Trinity, where, in fact, as a result of the death of someone who mattered very much to me and had kind of saved my PhD, and died far too young. And I applied for it. And I got it somewhat against the odds, I think. And that transformed what was possible for me in terms of academic space to do things and be things. So I taught at Trinity for 10 years, and it was a good experience. But those were also the 10 years in which I explored ordination, got ordained, and started to live as an ordained priest. And yeah, that was the running of two vocations alongside each other and had its own tensions.
Did you have any drivenness at this point, or was this still sort of happening to you? You've used those like being pulled, just life happening. What's?
I'm a driven person. I'm really like my dad.
Are you? When did that driven? I mean, did you reach a conscious position in your life? You thought, I can't go back to that. I need to work. I mean, you obviously worked very, very hard to get yourself through everything that you went through. But yeah, okay, let me ask the question this way. Where at this point, when this career starts to open, there seemed to be some fortuitousness. You talked about your academic career, but once you had them, were you like, I've got these and I'm going to press into them for all they're worth? Was that how that drivenness worked for you?
I would say it was more driven before that in some ways, once I had that secure post, it's difficult to say, because it was at that point that I was also exploring vocation, which was not a sensible piece of timing. So I was, if I'd been a properly driven academic, as an academic, the last thing I would have done would have been start to train for ordination. It was a nutty thing to do, because it stuffs up your research time totally. And without your research time, which heaven knows is precious enough, and there's little enough of it, you aren't going to go anywhere or do anything. If I was a proper academic, I would have used those 10 years to get another couple of books out, to get a really good lucrative grant on a sexy area of some kind, to go over to America for a couple of years and do some visiting professorship somewhere where I didn't have much of a teaching load, and then come back to some shinier, more senior posts in another university. I did not do any of that. I learnt how to teach as well as I could. I learnt how to be a priest. I was very involved with the welfare and intellectual kind of flowering of my own students. And I went on trying to discover what it was to be converted. But I'm not saying that I wasn't ambitious or that I wasn't driven, but I don't think it was, I didn't let myself entirely know what I was doing when I spent part of one sabbatical being an untrained volunteer healthcare assistant in the local hospital.
Right.
But it obviously wasn't getting my book written.
Yes. I mean, for a very driven person, then there must have been a strong vocational pull for you, spiritual pull for you to be able to, I mean, just the way you succinctly mapped out, every academic career that you know about, to know that you weren't going to do that, but do this. I
didn't let myself know completely.
Right.
That's a bit hindsight.
Right.
But I think what I can say, and also, Trinity is a funny place. It's a world of its own, and it's a very confident world of its own. So, you know, it could hold you in its certainty that there was nowhere better to be. You know, you didn't have to kind of question that. You'd have to put some effort into questioning that, because it's very sure of itself as a very safe. And so I could lean on that and not let myself know. But also, I mean, I don't know how else to describe the vocational process, but it's like there's a particular point in the way that the light falls when it's getting dark, particularly if you're near water, where what's actually happening is that the light is falling on the water, but what it looks like is as if the water is giving out light, a sort of greyish silvery light. And that is my image. That kind of light is my image for what I steer by. And it's what I've seen at kind of turning moments. So there was a turning moment. I was on retreat in Clare Priory before I went for ordination at all, and I saw that kind of light on the water of the river, and I can't even very clearly remember what happened. I only remember what the light looked like. And it was a pointing. It was a what they call a call, but it wasn't vocal for me. It's always light.
Light, stunning. I mean, this intersection between priesting and theology it is far more common in the Anglican Church than it is in my church tradition, low church evangelical. Yeah. In fact, one of the wonderful things for me is now my denomination and tribe value theological education. You know, we're institutionalizing in the best way and realizing that several decades on that, theology is good. But I was from that sort of low church background that people were worried when I was doing a theology degree, I might lose my faith. But I came to find, in fact, some of the biggest influence, before the interview today, we talked about Martin Percy. Encountering someone who had a priestly sensibility and grounding in parish life, and seeing the profound, not the forming forces of theological thinking. I just remember how much they inspired me as a younger person. Emma Percy has as well. Rowan Williams in particular. Reading him, and so for me, for my own, as a sort of jobbing pastor who'd stretched into theological education, first with the doctorate in ministry, then with the PhD. I remember friends really worried, saying, you can't do both. And I'd say, no, this is fuel. I couldn't do pastoral ministry without this theological fuel. There was a side of me that needed to be fed. That's been my own journey, and the discovery of the academic pastor, academic priesting role. And it is a particular role, and I found myself, it's one that is not sufficiently pastoral and not sufficiently academic, but there's something very different about it that's very precious. And I love the way that just that beautiful way, poetic way that you described your own sense of calling in that location. And you said it was about light. For me, it's about fire, fuel. It just gets me out of bed, keeps me going. From the funerals for babies through to dealing with issues of LGBTQ, whatever it is, it was beautiful the way that you expressed that. So could I ask you a bit, what's it been like for you in your priesting and theological dimensions? What's that like for you day to day now?
I very much recognise what you say about the one feeding the other. or you put it, I think you didn't put it quite like that, but that's sort of what I heard you say.
Yeah.
When I was being a parish priest, and in fact, no, when I was being a parish priest, there was, and I think this is right and goes back to what I said about relationships and thinking, and intellectual thinking not being entirely distinct. There is something about, you know, if you're doing that funeral for a baby, or you're visiting someone who's discovered they've got a terminal diagnosis, or just, you know, you're in front of that primary school trying to work out what activity might make the presence of God vivid or glimpsable and be fun, engaging, something that they'll remember. They are activities that take all your attention. They're not, you know, I don't entirely buy this distinction between the pastoral and the theological, really. I mean, I suppose that they're useful genre categories, but they're not as distinct as people say. And if theology is not about how we live in the presence of God, I don't know what it is about, really. And those points where, you know, I mean, if you're in the system of being, you know, the Anglican system, where you're being a kind of official pastor for a geographical area, which means that you'll meet lots of people who will say to you, I'm not really religious, or, you know, that even that's, you know, temporizing. What they mean is, I'm not religious at all, but here you are, and I don't want to be rude. Then what you're constantly doing is you're constantly carrying God into places. I don't mean that he's not already there. I just mean that as far as the sort of social structures are concerned, you've just walked God into their living room. And you, what you do then is a complex mixture of extending your antennae as far as they'll go to try and understand how that person is feeling and what they need and what they're yearning for and what they really hope you won't do and what they might need you to do even though they think they don't want it, and how into that the presence of God might be made a space for, and that seems to me to be a very taxing and complex and challenging task, about which it is not easy to write adequately, but it is theological.
Gosh, and of course you mix the domains of English literature and theology. I want to ask you about. Had this conversation with Alison Milbank. In fact, I sometimes think some of the best theology is written by people who don't have a theology degree, and they bring together wonderful disciplines. Of course, and I remember my PhD journey. Sort of when you finished it, you're like, well, it's blindingly obvious how to do it. I guess that's the nature of it. But you suddenly realize there's all these different disciplines and different domains and different methods, and then I remember the realization that the only reason these disciplines exist is not because they're technically correct representations of the world. It's just the way that they've done that way for so long, it becomes an accepted method. And then it starts to feel like, I used to describe to friends different supervisions and getting closer to finishing my PhD and having to own it myself. And that frightening thing of actually, no, this is what I now believe. It felt like, Harry Potter and Severus Professor Snape with everyone's secret methodologies, and suddenly you realize, and this is why I've loved Martin Percy. His work has really helped me see the artifice of some of these categories and domains, but actually how they can work together. And I see that with Alison Milbank in her writing. I see this English literature formation and theology, and I certainly, when reading this, I thought, am I reading theology, or am I reading a work of literature here, from so many domains woven through it that you mentioned at the start. So let me ask you about those two worlds of English literature and theology. How do you feel that your English literature training, teaching has helped with the way that you read scripture and the tradition of the church and doing your theology?
I think it's fundamental.
Right.
There's so many different things, so many different ways I want to answer that. I don't know where to start. I think the technique, if technique is the right word, that is fundamental to how I read scripture is an absolutely kind of, it's a very Cambridge English technique, which is close reading. I know that my kind of years of training and teaching in close reading informs everything about how I read scripture. And in fact, an earlier version of Holiness and Desire, the uncut version, because that version is about half the length of what I actually wrote, had a whole section comparing the edifice of the kind of unitary edifice of scripture with the unitary edifice of Shakespeare's studies, which is has some very kind of comparable tensions and conundrums, in that, Shakespeare didn't write the whole of Shakespeare. Shakespeare might not have meant what people have subsequently understood him to have meant, and he certainly didn't think that he was what people have subsequently understood him to have been. In some ways, you can see the way that the identity that Ben Jonson kind of shoves onto Shakespeare as a writer with a capital W, playing into a way of reading him that he could never have planned or expected, in terms of what he actually was in his own context. But then once you've got people reading that way, you've got a whole structure that you can't circumvent. You've got a particular reverential way of saying, this is a word that's not just a word, it's a Shakespeare word. So we have to read it in a different way. And oh my goodness, what are we going to do if it was actually written by George Peele? So I felt I kind of met some of the problems of biblical criticism before in Shakespeare studies, and which version of Hamlet was really the first one, and does it matter? But the other thing I found myself thinking when you were talking is that when I was a professional English person, a professional literary critic, if you like, I don't think that's quite the right term, but I became more and more aware of my discipline as a kind of encrustation, a sort of caddisfly encrustation on work that was intended in a quite other way. Here I was showing my students how to read in this way or in that way, giving them, the historicist perspective or the structuralist perspective or whatever it might be, getting them to read the piles and piles of criticism that came from different ideological positions, all in order that they might read a novel intended to be read in the afternoon by a bored middle-class woman who didn't have anything else to do. And it seemed like a kind of misuse of the in the best sense, the gratuitous nature of making stuff. You know, there's a way of delighting in made stuff by looking at how it was made, and I'm all for that. And there's a whole industry of kind of clinging to the back of stuff that somebody else made, which I think is not so pretty. And it's a whole industry. It's an academic industry, and I don't know what I think about it, really.
I think I can intimate some of it from just from the way you pose the question. Now, there are a surprising number of priests who were accomplished poets and feature on undergraduate courses in English. So John Donne, George Herbert, Thomas Traherne, Gerard Manley Hopkins, R.S. Thomas. Did any of those inform or help your life as a parish priest in Cambridge? Are they part of your grounding or rich hinterland in any way? Do you hear their verse when you look out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how not?
Yeah.
I mean, they came first, really, because that was, you know, my central academic area, both in terms of research and in terms of teaching, were those people. It was that poetry. It was the, you know, late 16th and early to mid 17th up to kind of Restoration and a bit beyond, poets and devotional prose writers who I worked on and taught and examined PhDs in and all the rest of it. So that came first, really. And I think there was a part of me, that kind of very literal part of me, that thought that going and looking after a parish in South Cambridgeshire would be a very Herbertian thing to do. It wasn't like that, of course, but I think he was a model who was barely sustainable with an awful lot of effort when I had 3 parishes and became totally out of reach once I had 5.
Do you have any volumes of unpublished poetry?
Volumes would be a bit strong. I have written poems. I don't think that is where I think I am a prose writer, but I think I use the valencies, the sort of layeredness of poetic thinking in how I write prose. I think that's when I can be most a poet, when I'm writing prose.
Gosh. Let me ask you about music. So you've had a wonderful outlining of the importance of music in your life and instruments. What place does music play in your life now? And the oboe, does it still feature?
I hardly play.
Yeah.
I hardly play the oboe. I keep playing the piano. I have music in my head all the time. If there isn't a particular piece sort of working its way round, working itself out, then there are some melodic patterns that I've had in my head since I was a small child, which simply play out very slowly, and they're always the same. They have the same variations, but they're always there. I hear music every day in the cathedral, of course, because we have sang even song every day. So there are plain chants that will work their way around. There are settings of things that will sort of surprise me. In some ways, and I found this in the very musical setting of the university as well, because there are so many there are so many professional musicians, whether you use that with a big P or a little p, that it is hard to have the confidence to be an amateur. I do find that hard. During lockdown, it was kind of great because nobody was coming in and out of the house, and I decided I was going to go backwards from B major and play the Bach's 48 backwards. I'm not literally backwards, but just start at the last one and move backwards.
The pieces rather than playing it backwards, yes.
And that was a pleasure that I hadn't had for years and years and years. I can't listen to music and do something else anymore. I used to be able to as a teenager, but I can't now. If I'm listening to music, I could sew maybe, but I can't read.
I mean, the way you describe the melodic in your life and almost a mapping of your life, it sounds almost like a kind of synesthesia. Do you see the world? I know like when I talk to my wife, you have that thing where I go, oh well, the weekend is longer and there's colors for date, I understand that sort of synesthesia, but as you were talking about it, it was like, are you sort of seeing, feeling the melody of the world around you?
I do have that absolutely simple synesthesia. So all the different keys are different colours, and they've always been the same different colours ever since I was small. C has always been dark red, and A has always been blue, and it's a brighter blue if it's A major, kind of thing. What I am finding is happening, it may be a sort of aging process thing, I don't know, is happening an awful lot, is those sort of apparently random neurological connections. So I might be sitting in evensong and the choir is singing a plain song, and I will have a very vivid, not just picture, but a kind of olfactory and mood memory of what it was like to be in the biology lab in 1976, or what it was like to be on top of Leith Hill on a Sunday afternoon, age 6, or there'll be those. So it's almost. I had a friend who, when he was dying, he was a musician. When he was dying, he talked about hearing music moving in fifths, violins playing up and down in fifths. The kind of slow working out of very simple melodic progressions that is at the bottom of my mind is more like that sort of basic underpinning than like the world turning.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. Thank you. We're on the home straight, and now turning to some questions about your writing a bit more. So you contributed to 2 books produced by the Littlemore group, Praying for England, Priestly Presence in Contemporary Culture, and For God's Sake, Reimagining Priesthood and Prayer in a Changing World. Could you tell us a little bit about the aims of the Littlemore group?
Sure. Well, I came I became involved with the Littlemore group through Sam Wells. We just ended up sitting next to each other at something or other in Cambridge and got talking. And when he and Sarah were, it was just after Rowan Williams had become Archbishop of Canterbury, and I think the thought was that perhaps this could be a group which could do something to bring together the kind of resources and riches of Anglican academic theology with the nourishing of people spiritually, on the back of Rowan Williams talking about reimagining the faith of the nation, vivifying it. So there was an initial conference in 2005 when I was in fact pregnant with my second daughter. And I wasn't at that point a parish priest, because the idea was that it would connect with the parochial, not with the academy, but with people doing the stuff on the ground in the parish system. So I went as I think I was rather grandly called an academic consultant. And the experience of that particular conference, I think, had quite a lot to do with my decision some years later to leave academia and become a parish priest. And the group, when it got to the end of this conference and was thinking about what next, I mean, the book was, the Praying for England was the book that was the what next. But also a number of us felt that it had a future as a group to go on trying to do that work, to do that reconciliatory work, I suppose. So we went on meeting, we met twice a year, residential every other year, and day meetings twice a year. And they were extraordinarily stimulating and fruitful. And the second of them was trying to, which was the one For God's Sake came out of eventually, was trying to think about what on earth, whether there was a space anywhere for what we were kind of loosely calling the scholar priest. So not the career academic in academic theology, and not the straight sort of pastoral, but for someone who brought that, and not necessarily someone who publishes, but someone who brought that kind of attention to the particularity of the cure of souls, which is, you know, a phrase I think is very helpful. And For God's Sake came out of that, but it also, because of when it was written, it, for me, I mean, I was one of the editors for it. And for me, it also came out of my gradual understanding, or my gradual realization, that the model that I really desperately wanted to be true, the sort of Herbertian Michael Ramsey type model of, you know, the priest at the altar with the people on his heart, was unsustainably heavy when the church was spread so thin, and there was just not that kind of cohesion of community to hold it, make it possible. So in a way, it's also a book written out of a recognition of the impossibility of the model.
Gosh, I'm sorry. I could just talk to you for another hour about this whole topic. And of course, Sarah Coakley was an editor, wasn't she? I mean, again,
Yes.
talking about priestly theologians. So yeah, Sam Wells and then Sarah Coakley, just stunning.
Yes, I co-edited that book with Sarah. So yeah,
fantastic. Amazing. Thank you. Ask you about For God's Sake, is perhaps even more than the first an examination of the Anglican parochial system and its future, if I've understood it rightly.
Correct.
How did you end up co-editing that book? were you asked? Did you offer to be? Was it a project that did it come out of the overflow of these meetings? You know, many conversations that just, I'll do that. How did that happen?
It came out of that 2011 conference, the Scholar Priest conference, but it took a while to sort of come to fruition. I think I didn't offer. I think someone suggested I should do it, and I was at that point, although the Littlemore group started as people who are in parochial ministry plus other ecumenical kind of partners. In the way of things, as time had gone on, the personnel stayed the same, but their jobs changed. So I was one of the relatively few who was still in parochial ministry at that point. So I think that was part of it. But also it was just about, what person has the academic background and is in parochial ministry and will be able to work with Sarah and is kind of really deeply involved in this particular question in an urgent kind of in an urgent way that their life is bound up with, and it was me.
Gosh, wonderful. Oh, I daren't move on, but I need to for these last few questions. Now, I did ask your husband Francis whether his parents had read The Child the Books Built. So I can't resist asking whether David and Bernice, with their interests themselves in secularization and modern society, has read and commented on these earlier books by you. What did they make of a daughter with this responsibility for the phrase you used, the cure of souls, and your writing?
Yes, they did.
They did.
Yes. I have shown them everything I've written, with the exception of Holiness and Desire, which my mother went on reading, but my father, most of it was written after he died, apart from the first chapter. And in fact, it was slower in the writing because he was starting to die at the point where I started to write it. So it went on hold for a bit. And that was a slow process. So it was about 2 years late as a book. But no, they are, and in my father's case, were interlocutors always. Good intellectual kind of partners and sounding boards. And my mother is using this lockdown to write something about unpaid caring, because if you're stuck in your house on your own for most of the year, that's what else would you do? Yeah.
I could just imagine your mother giving you her analytical assessment of your writing with
exactly.
Yeah. Brilliant. Now, if I can come to your book Holiness and Desire, having touched on it a little in this interview, its subject is the relationship between human wanting and the desire for God. And the starting point is a long quote from Thomas Traherne, which starts with the statement, "Wants are the bands and the ligatures between God and us." And I do want to just say, for my own reading as a pastor, that we use that terminology in my denomination, and on issues of human sexuality, and it's not my research interest, but having a PhD, you get asked to do research on topics, and I remember collating about 130 sources, and of course this was a few years ago and didn't have this book, and I wish I'd had something like this. This was just so different, Jessica, as a work. And as I say, at the beginning, you talk about the different modes that you're going to use in the book, but often I find books, especially on a topic like this, I guess I'm looking for, okay, is this going to be the deductive one? This is going to be the one that goes, here's the text, here's the context, and here's what you should believe. I found myself flicking through it, like, what's the punchline? What does Jessica really think or believe that's, however it's dressed up. And other books are inductive, you know, they draw you in over time. But your book was utterly abductive for me. I mean, I went into it with my antennae trained to look for answers, you know, what can you do, what can't you do, what's the right interpretation, but instead found myself just drawn into an experience of thinking, you know, I lost all my apprehensions of thinking through how might I use this, to reflecting on myself, reflecting on my own wants, my own experiences, mapping that pastorally against, you know, lots of people just came to mind. It was like they would appear before me when I was going through it. So I don't know how much that was intentional in your writing, but it's profoundly written and on a topic that's controversial, but is incredibly beautiful and moving at the same time. And I found myself having to reflect a lot on my own wants and my own desires and who I am as a human being. So thank you for that. But could you tell us a little bit about what you were trying to do with the book, and what you were consciously trying to do?
I think there's a public thing and there's a private thing. So the public thing is that I got drawn in more or less by accident into this topic, you know, almost 15 years ago, because I got asked to contribute to a collection that was responding to some issues in human sexuality, while I was still an academic, and then I ended up being on a formal sort of Church of England group, the Pilling Group, which was then overtaken by same-sex marriage. So, and then I ended up being on Living in Love and Faith, which is the Anglican thing that's just come out just now. And like you, I learned, because remember, I've not been taught theology properly. I've got a postgraduate certificate, I think.
And may you never learn it properly.
I learned what courteous disagreement looks like in all, I mean, and sometimes discourteous, but often very courteous and completely intransigent disagreement looks like. And it looks like you put it really well, but I can't remember what you said. There are various methods that you use that appear to be entirely impartial or neutral, but actually they tend to a particular conclusion. And you know, all stripes of conviction will do this, and they'll do this with different academic methods depending on how they've been trained, or what their, you know, what their particular sort of center of gravity is in terms of their theological thinking. But you know, whether it's someone pointing out that polygamy was usual for early Jewish kings, or whether it's saying, look, you know, Romans 1 just says what it says, you kind of know what you're going to get pretty quickly. And it did not seem to me that this was something you could really call conversation. It was sort of being in the same room and making kind of hermetically sealed objects to look at. And I also noticed that the kind of the desideratum of objectivity was being kind of tested to destruction by everybody, because actually, you know, the more you press on it, the more it's not there. And I've sat through a shed load of these meetings with people who are gay having to say they're gay, or having to talk about their private life. And I've sat there, you know, unmarried mother with a history of domestic violence, and never had to say a word, never had to say a thing about my own private life, because I'm married to children who would need to ask anything about that. And it seemed absurd, because I knew that the things that were my vulnerabilities or my prejudices or my expectations were absolutely taken out of my own history and experience, which is not to say that there is not an, you know, I'm not a policy maker, and that book's not meant to be about making policy. It's meant to be about making space. And what the space is for is to say, you know, what is the Spirit saying to the churches? Because nobody's listening. We're just speaking and speaking and speaking.
I wish we could have had a whole interview just on this book. I mean, two things I will, if I can, at the end of our interview here. I mean, I caught the sort of Acts 10 unfolding moment. I found that very compelling myself. You talk about Peter on the roof and wondering about food to Gentiles, and you know, the notion that original context is set in stone for all of history and human experience. I don't believe that eschatologically we're still on that moment. The Acts 10 is unfolding still, but you do that without using any of those words I just said. You just induct us into this story with Peter that make you think, oh yeah, I wonder, what about this? And today it was absolutely stunning that you did that. Oh, sorry, I could ask you too many questions, but I won't, other than people listening to this really need to read this, and I'm recommending it to everyone. I will ask you one more question. So desire features in here, and it felt very Augustinian.
It is. It's absolutely. It's a complete Augustinian steal.
I assumed it was. I mean, you've got a few footnotes, but I'm like, you know, and I love Augustine enough from my own PhD. Looked at Augustinian, in part, accounts of. I was looking at the relationship between evangelicalism and capitalism, and that's a question I want to ask you at the close here. But yes, convinced about the place of desire and being misformed and desiring wrongly. And then as we desire wrongly, we have habits that, you know, just go round in circles and cause us to desire things incorrectly. And worship is supposed to reform our desires and train us. And there's, you know, from my tradition, there's this beautiful, I still think it's beautiful, evangelical social imaginary, but it's become corrupted. That's what my own research looked at. So again, I'm like, oh yeah, I get this desire is the root of agency and formation and identity. And if we could just admit the desires that we have. And I felt as a pastor, so often we're willing to step. The example that you gave, you know, the poor person who is gay, who has to go to a place of exposure of their private life in a way that other people don't. But it's like these. You and I, you know, I'm a pastor. When people behind the curtain tell me what's really going on in their life, at the bottom it is desire, and misdesire for things that they could never talk about in public. And we have these pseudo conversations that mean these things stay trapped here. And your book was utterly compelling, never mind for LGBTQ things. But if we could just be honest, and surely priesting, church, ecclesiology, worship is supposed to provide the place where our desires can be revealed. I mean, for goodness sake, if sometimes think, have you ever read scripture and the desires that are laid bare there? So let me ask you about consumerism. So you analyze the disconnect of that consumerism brings with faith and fidelity in human relationships. So let me ask you, really just jump straight to a sort of conclusion for a practice. What do you think are practices which can bring people back into relationship with the divine? I guess I'm thinking of them as, you know, worship broadly, not necessarily, you know, liturgical things within a church context, but that understanding that what we do shapes who we become and what we receive. So what are practices that might bring people back into relationship with the divine in our commodified society?
I think I'd go back to Traherne. And I point to two things, and one is creatureliness, in that when we remember that we are creatures, that we're not gods, we're not sovereign, we are we are in the relationship that we're in to God is that of fleeting made things. So that's not very well put.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean.
Rather than as kind of little gods stalking about, sort of trying to dispose and impose, when actually we don't even know ourselves very well. But creatures who are utterly known and made, all those images, the clay and the potter, or that extraordinary image in Isaiah. He sits and he looks at the people of the world, and they're like grasshoppers. Those aren't meant. They're not meant to belittle, but our littleness is a kind of freedom, and it disposes how we live. We live turned towards our Maker. We don't live with our elbows out, kind of striding the world and pretending to be a colossus, because we're really small, and that means we have to always think about ourselves in relationship, both to the world that we inhabit and each other. And that points to the other kind of Traherneian thing, which is the word that he calls obligation. He says we're infinitely obliged, and I think he means by that both creatureliness, but he also means that we depend upon everything around us to subsist at all. We are in debt all the time. Debt is how we live, and it takes a very peculiar society to forget how dependent we are for our subsistence. And we're living in that peculiar society. We never have to think where our next meal comes from, or the electricity that keeps us warm, but actually all those things are built on a web of relationships, many of which are frankly wicked ones. And it's when we, I'm going to use the words of a famous atheist: sin is treating people as things. And when we commodify, we treat people as things. And when we forget our infinite obligation, we treat people as things. But they're not. They're also people, and we are infinitely obliged. I think that's the mode that would push against commodification more than any other.
Thank you. I remember reading Oliver O'Donovan, Desire of Nations and Resurrection and the Moral Order, and his ethics and theology, and getting my head around notions of, he talks about subject and object, and we're I guess because of issues of aseity in our modern society, we mistake who God is and who we are. And worship is supposed to reorder the relationship between us as subjects, and for me, from my evangelical worship tradition, ultimately it was just this moment of like, we're supposed to be God-made, not self-made. Exactly. And at the root of commodification is this, that I can create and make this innate desire to create ourselves, but it's only in Christ that we can fulfill that desire for identity and meaning and purpose. And we've our worship, and again in my tradition, has been co-opted in this self-creation instead of God creation, and just the beauty that is available in an identity that is God-made. Thank you. Last two questions for you. One about your role at the Cathedral. So you have a responsibility at Ely Cathedral for outreach and education. How are your meditations on holiness and desire influencing how you develop your outreach and education? Do they feature in your day-to-day work there?
I hope that I'm shaped by what's essentially a monastic tradition here. That's more about the worship, but basically it's a tiny little monastery of sort of 4 residents and lots of people who come in and out. That's a bit idealized, but actually, it has all the pains of that as well as its good things. In terms of the kinds of program, so for example, we've had a sort of social justice program in this last in the autumn, and more and more, I mean, I've been getting more and more involved in issues around modern slavery and exploitative work, and just how blurred the line that is between things that everyone goes, oh, that's absolutely terribly wicked, and things which people say, oh, but that's just how the world is in the gig economy. Those two things are not unrelated in the way that people want to say that they are, and there are a great many people living very terrible lives simply because people's businesses practices are very efficient. And so I see a connect between the increasing amount of work that I'm doing in that area and what I felt I learnt through writing Holiness and Desire.
Last question. I wish it wasn't. I hope I get to ask you some more questions. I have so enjoyed this time with you today, Jessica. What are you thinking through and working on at the minute? I want to know what you're going to be writing next. Is there anything in the pipeline?
There is. I'm writing for something called the Bampton Lectures in Oxford, which I'm giving next May. Something called Four Dimensional Eucharist. So the idea is that, if you write a book about how people are not in right relationship, and you kind of say that worship is how you get back into a right relationship, you've got to put your money where your mouth is and write about worship. And in the Anglican tradition, the Eucharist sort of, certainly since the parish communion movement, has sat right in the middle of that as a kind of default setting almost, rather than a high point. I mean, I hope it's both, but it's certainly a default setting. And so I wanted to think about the Eucharist in ways that are not perhaps they're not straightforwardly theological. They're also experiential and cultural and a bit anthropological, and sort of asking, this act of ritual theatre in its different dimensions, from the two-dimensional to what happens in space to what happens in time. What on earth are we doing? And does God come and give us what we need when we are inconsistently skeptical about what is happening? And when we have this rite of presence that is also absence, what does it give us? Does it give us presence or absence? And what do we think we're doing? And what on earth have we thought we were doing all the way through lockdown, when we've done it without there being any physical presence at all? So that's what I'm doing next.
Oh gosh, well, I'll be looking out for those. So that will be, you said May?
Yeah. And it will end up being a book the following year.
Fantastic. And maybe people will be able to get to see and listen to you in person by May.
Yes, though we will also be live streaming and all the rest of it, just in case.
Wonderful. We'll try and get links, as they say in the show notes. We'll try and get some links to that. Gosh, fantastic. Thank you for that. So Jessica, thank you. I've worked you very, very hard today. Thank you for all these few hours that you have given me of your time. Thank you for the letting us see, as is the aim of these oral history type interviews, to discover what made people in public life, Christians in public life, made them. And it really has been a delight to interview you, and thank you for what you have been vulnerable with. Been very precious today, and thank you for your thoughts, and thank you for your leadership, and thank you for your public ministry and all that you're doing. And thank you again. It's been wonderful.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.